Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today, as part of the International Booker Prize longlist, I wanted to talk about this book, Hunchback by Saou Ichikawa and translated by Barton. I will go into some spoilers a little bit later into this, particularly for one point that I want to speak about, which is the ending. But apart from that, the rest of this should be relatively open, I think, in talking about this book. And this is one of the very short books on this year's long list. It's one of those long lists where, apart from Solenoid and even Under the Eye of the Big Bird, which is not that long, really, you've got all of these very little books. And it's interesting how much Hunchback is able to fit into that. So let's get talking a little bit about this book itself. So this book is quite noticeable and notable for many reasons. In its native country of Japan, it won a fairly prestigious literary award and was a book that felt quite game-changing in many ways, from what I understand. And it's an interesting one on this long list just because of how distinctive this voice is. And I made the mistake of reading this on a flight, and particularly reading it on like a tablet. And as a result, it was very, very well lit whilst the cabin turned dark. And the opening pages of this book are very explicit, particularly in going into real depth into a sex scene. And this book is full of these. But what I think becomes really apparent right from the beginning is the way that this book uses these sex scenes for other sort of points. It's not just for titillation in this book. It always has something else that it's doing. And in particular, at the beginning of this book, we find that it's somewhat of a feint that's been delivered to us by the author, where this quite intense sex scene actually just turns out to be the writings of our character. And our character, Shaka, is this young woman who is disabled and is reliant on various machines and other things to keep her alive. So she is there in this hospital bed, and there are frequent references to things like her needing to remove fluid so that she doesn't choke, and all of these other things where she's basically very reliant on the hospital around her. We learn quite quickly that she is from a very wealthy family, and therefore the writing that she's doing, such as those sex scenes, are done entirely for her own pleasure, and also the money she makes from those she just gives to charity or to people who need it, because she herself doesn't need the money. And it creates this situation right from the beginning where we know that she is involved in this life that's full of duality, where her physical day-to-day life is pretty much only between two rooms, from her hospital bed to another room and then often back again. And we know that her life is full of that, but this other world that she lives in and inhabits is full of fantasy and this really lurid, intense, sort of graphic sex scenes. So we've got these two parts going on with her life, and this soon turns into something else, where quite early into the book we have the central proposition or plot device, I guess, within this book, which is that there is something she wants, which is she has this quite intense fantasy of becoming pregnant. And it sort of is tied up with a lot of other things around sex and what have you as well. So she embarks on these missions via Twitter and various other messaging platforms, basically, to get somebody who might consider this. And the rest of the book sort of spins off from that. But what I think is really interesting is the way this book portrays that, because there's an almost clinical and cold detachment in so much of this book. The author, the narrator writes in this, speaks in this way that is cold and calm and collected in many ways, of just, look, I just want sperm so I can get pregnant. I just want to do this. Here is this thing. It's not even a fantasy. It's a fantasy, but it's also a thing that she just wants to achieve. And the rest of the book sort of spins out from that. And I found it really interesting and kind of comical the way this book frames that and has this really big life decision, particularly for somebody who is in a physical condition where the pregnancy wouldn't necessarily be a very good thing for her body, but where she also wants to, I suppose, explore other elements of this. And the book creates this whole idea around it that she is just wondering what it would be like. It's a thought experiment she can engage in because she has the financial means. And the book is quite keen to also show that she understands that she's in a very privileged position, that she could explore that without having to think about it from a financial lens, that she has the means to be able to do this. But I found that the way the book does this is so funny, but also just quite startling. It's so cold and transactional that it is almost funny in and of itself because of that, because of just how cut off from any human feelings around pregnancy or whatever else. It's so strange. But in many ways, the book is also playing with that idea of her as this figure who is somewhat separate from the world. She is in this hospital bed and is wanting to live, quote unquote, a normal life, as she sees it, to do all these things that exist outside of her room. And in some ways, having this setup also means that she's going to have regular contact with people in the physical world who will be part of the whole process. And this is, yeah, it's an odd little book. I can't say or kind of tell really if I liked it or was put off by it. I think I really loved the uniqueness of this voice. It's a very directly challenging and troubling voice. It's directly somebody who is meant to stand out and be an outcast in several ways and to talk about things in ways that would be shocking. But I think at the same time, the book is playing with this and there's something so fun about that. At the same time, I don't know. I think when the book was over, I think I almost had wanted more or had wanted to develop some of these ideas slightly further. But at the same time, that's where we are. So I think overall, I liked this, but I had some reservations with it. I think it was over so quickly that I couldn't necessarily put my finger on anything more. And it's also really difficult to talk about this book without talking about the ending. So I'm going to go into spoiler territory here, and feel free to join me there if you need to log off from this part. By all means do so. But yeah, I think it's an interesting book. And because it's such a short read, I still think even if it doesn't sound like your thing, it could still be a fun way to spend an hour just to read this and see how you feel about it. So into spoiler territory, the book deliberately starts playing with things at the end. And this is a really difficult book to talk about without the ending because of how critical it is to this whole conversation. Because the book is left on somewhat of a cliffhanger in the idea that all of this could itself have just been a story created. And that is deliberately playing with a lot of the tropes of the story itself. You know, we have a character who is writing these elaborate, fanciful stories, and in doing so is able to think outside of a situation that they're in. But equally, if all of this itself is a story, there's a meta element of this all being a fantasy, that it's not just a disabled woman who is only ever between two rooms wanting this idea of being pregnant, but also the idea of what twisted and intense stories do we make up as in service of fantasy or in service of expressing other parts of ourselves that might feel darker and more twisted and less socially acceptable. And so therefore, if all of this itself is a story within a story, then who is actually the narrator? Do we then revert back to this being a story told by Saou Ichikawa themselves? Is this their story? Is this a story of another narrator or character within this book who also wants to write this fantasy and is doing so? And the book plays with who this might be, but I think there's something really interesting about this idea that if this is all a story itself that's been fabricated, and obviously we're reading a novel, so we are also reading a fabricated, fictionalized thing anyhow. But if we're doing that, then what is reality? Where does this really start? And is it more or less poignant for that reason? If this is actually just someone's fantasy of a disabled woman wanting to get pregnant, and that being a fantasy in itself of this, you know, less common or less discussed thing, is that itself the point of this book? This becomes a commentary on fantasy and the way that it is a way of expressing parts of ourselves? Or is this all just a joke in itself about would a person who is in that condition and is living a life like that, where so much of their life is being powered by machines around them, would that life make more or less sense if we allowed this fantasy within it that feels so foreboding and you know, something you don't touch? And so I think there's something really fun going on with that. And in some ways, the ending brought me a lot of joy, that I thought this was a fun thing to throw into the mix, the sort of last hand grenade at the end of the book. But at the same time, it is slightly frustrating because it to some degree also diminishes parts of the story in some ways for me. That if this is all fantasy, then does it feel more lurid and more twisted or less real because of all of that? So yeah, that's kind of where I sit with this book. It's deliberately a book that is provocative and in your face and plays around with all of these ideas. And I think that's the point. I get the feeling that this is a book that wants to challenge you and wants to throw these things out at you to cause surprise and alarm. But at the same time, it makes for quite an odd reading experience because the book is both holding you away at a distance and also inviting you in, and it's quite a strange mix at times. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this very strange and interesting little book. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. So take care, speak to you all soon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.